Everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really glad that you've been able to join us, and I'm also most grateful to our speakers who have agreed to speak to us and share their knowledge and experience on decolonizing economics. So the session will start in 1 to 2 minutes when we have more speakers. Yeah, so please bear with us for 1 to 2 minutes. Yeah, hello. I think we can start. Thank you everyone once again for joining. This is the last lecture of the Pluralist Economics Workshop. We've had 3 lectures today and this is the 4th one. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Abdulrasheed Isa and I'm a lecturer in economics at Nile University of Nigeria and also a PhD candidate at the Center for Development Research at the University of Bonn in Germany. And I'm really glad to welcome all of you to this panel on decolonizing economics, perspectives of young African economists. I'm really impressed with our panel and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from them. And please engage as much as you can using the Q&A function. If you have any question or comment, feel free to drop it there. Each of the speakers will talk for 10 minutes. So in the first 30 minutes, we will listen to them, but possibly we can spill over to maybe 40 minutes. And then there will be Q&A session for about 20 minutes, and then the session will close. Yeah, so briefly, let me introduce our speakers. We have Michelle Groenewald. She's a lecturer in economics at Northwest University in South Africa. She holds a master's in political economy and development from School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University of London, where she was a brilliant classmate of mine, and I'm really glad to have studied together with her. She's very brilliant and intelligent. She also holds master's and bachelor's degree in economics from Northwest University. She has expertise in political economy, institutional economics, and economics education, where she is currently teaching a pluralist economics module, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her experience. Mr. Bandile Ngidi, he's the project coordinator for the Rethinking Economics project at the Institute for Economic Justice in Johannesburg, South Africa. Previously, he worked at the National Minimum Wage Research Initiative and at Oxfam in South Africa. He holds Masters in Development Theory and Policy from Wits University. He joined the Institute in August 2018 and is currently working on incubating Rethinking Economics for Africa movement. They hold conferences annually. Yeah, that movement promotes economic pluralism and alternative economic discourse and economic policy. Institute for Economic Justice is a think tank that I always admire because they release a lot of very critical policy documents and briefs, and I wish we can have one like that here in Nigeria. Maybe Bandile can share some insights with us. And lastly, Mr. Abel Gaiya holds an MSc Development Economics from SOAS, just like Michelle. And Abel is a very good friend of mine. We studied on the same scholarship and the same program at SOAS, and even the same hostel in London. So he's someone, I feel this is like a homecoming, like a reunion for me. He's interested in development economics, history of economic thought, and international political economy, comparative capitalism, economics and religion. So he's like all over the place. He's currently an analyst at Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. And I think Busara has its headquarters in Kenya. They are the new frontiers of development economics, so to speak. They do mostly behavioral economics, randomized control trials. But I think Abel is more institutionalist and radical in his approach. So thank you for joining us. And we will start with Michelle. So Michelle, if you can, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Abdul. I really appreciate it. I'm going to do some screen sharing. Let me know if you guys can see the screen. It should have the title of the presentation.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. I'm going to try to not be, I told Abdul, a typical academic, and I'm going to try to actually stick to 10 minutes. So I'm going to perhaps talk a little bit on the fast side. But please, I really look forward to the question and answer session, and hopefully we can engage more in that section. I'm really looking forward to the other panelists also speaking. I'm a big admirer, so I'm really looking forward to the session. Thanks so much for the opportunity. I'm really honored. So I had titled this presentation, Our Journey as Economists to Unlearn. I will also say as a woman, it was particularly lovely to be a young African economist. I'm certainly not complaining about that one. I had thought that it would be appropriate for me to perhaps start with a picture that was taken by Ihsan Haffajee in 2016 when we were having the Fees Must Fall protests here in South Africa, which really saw a massive call for free decolonized education. And I thought that this was a really a picture that makes me feel a lot of things. But I thought that it was worthwhile, you know, economists with their love of numbers and graphs and modeling and equations. I think we sometimes get disconnected from what it is that we're actually dealing with, which is at the very heart of it, people, and to remind ourselves that this is a social science. And really just to testify as we start to begin to grapple with this idea of what it means to decolonize economics, to begin to grapple with this idea about the massively important work that happens outside of universities, outside of ivory towers. And a lot of what I'm going to be focusing on is going to be about the importance that students play in this discussion about decolonizing economics. And so I thought that it was just really important for us to pay tribute to students who put their bodies and their lives on the line, for us to be able to, I think, you know, a lot of the discussions that we're having today, at least in South Africa, is because of what students were calling for during these protests. And I thought it was worthwhile for us to just perhaps take a second to think through that. So I have, like a typical academic, just started with a context slide. I firstly just want to say that I'm keenly aware of my own positionality. I may have been born and raised in South Africa, and other than when Abdul and I were studying together in London, I've lived my whole life here in South Africa. But especially in talking about a topic such as decolonizing economics, I'm keenly aware of my own whiteness and my own white privilege. And so I would really appreciate it if anyone feels that I have overstepped or taken up too much space, to really please engage me in the question and answer session, I would really appreciate that. I mean, I know that this is kind of 3 presenters that are speaking, but I had put this as a second bullet point. You know, this is actually supposed to be in a workshop. So I would love it if in the question and answer session, it was less a case of asking me questions as if I am the fount of all knowledge, but really for anyone who wants to participate to share their own knowledges and their own experiences, their own lived realities. That's kind of my call for the question and answer session, so that it is like more of a workshop. I do want to emphasize that much as I'm talking about this concept of decolonizing, I'm certainly not attempting to be prescriptive. I think I had put over here what I think is a really powerful and important quote about decolonizing, that it has multiple meanings and the desires and investments that animate it are diverse, contested, and at times at odds with one another. And I think part of the discussion that might sometimes be frustrating is to say, well, you know, we don't have clean, neat lines about what decolonizing even is. I think it's really valuable for us to sit in that discomfort and for us to work through it, to talk through it, to discuss it, to write about it, to figure out what it means to live it, to research more about it. And really what I had just wanted to emphasize here, that, you know, this idea that we can simply add scholars from the global south to our reading list, much as I think that is vitally important, is simply not enough. And it potentially makes decolonizing become nothing more than a buzzword or a tick box that people get to tick off. I mean, I don't have enough time to be able to go into all the literature, but if anyone is not all that familiar with it or would like a place to start, I would really recommend Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Tak and Yang, their 2012 paper, or Nayantara Appleton has written a really great, in essence, blog piece called Do Not Decolonize If You Are Not Decolonizing, which I can highly recommend and has made me reflect a lot in my own practices. I really just wanted to emphasize that decolonizing, at least for me, is a process. It's something that we're working towards that is unlikely to ever reach perfect completion. And really just to emphasize that, you know, there's a lot of webinars happening right now, a lot of discussion, which is so exciting and really encouraging. But to really emphasize that this, I would argue, is a lifelong commitment. And so much as I'm going to be focusing a lot on economics curricula today, to really just emphasize that the economics curricula are embedded in institutions that need to be decolonized, both formal ones, but also seeing as lots of people have a background in institutional economics, I mean, there are a lot of informal institutions too, which are really embedded in economies themselves that need to be decolonized. So not enough time to actually go into all of that, but just a little bit of context. I titled the next slide Unlearning Accepted Power Relations, because really something that I've experienced in my own applications of attempting to teach in a different way is really the importance of understanding that underpinning a lot of what it is that we're seeing in our economics curricula is that we have to unlearn accepted power relations. I mean, not just in economics, but it is, you know, particularly pernicious here, I would argue. So, you know, very often your lecturers and academics, and I don't know exactly who is watching this webinar today, but very often, you know, your lecturers might be seen as like the founts of all knowledge. And I really want to emphasize that they shouldn't be, that students should be seen as equal partners in their economics curriculum. That things like students' expertise and their lived experiences should count just as much as the academic who happens to be standing in front of you and lecturing. And so I think Ndlovu Khatsheni's work is really foundational and has really guided me a lot, especially in this quote about epistemic freedom is not about democratizing knowledge from its current rendition in the singular. Well, epistemic freedom is about democratizing knowledge from its current rendition in the singular into its plural known as knowledges. I mean, I wish I had more time, but I mean, if you just take a look on that slide, how the word knowledges is underlined in red, we can begin to see just how problematic it is that we have this idea about one knowledge and what that entails, and especially how problematic this is within the discipline of economics. So really, a lot of this is a call for students to ask your lecturers for what it is that you want. And I had kind of found myself asking this question as I was preparing for this guest lecture: how do we unlearn that what students actually need is that they are one of the most powerful guiding forces in changing our economics, right? How do we unlearn that students have been told they are not this powerful force, that they are not equal partners, that they are there to imbibe the knowledge that is being given to them by people who know a lot more than what they do. And so I really think that I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what I have tried to do in my classroom. I would really love to hear other ideas or suggestions or other experiences when we get to the Q&A section. But something that I feel particularly passionate about is getting students to co-create both the content and assessment of their curriculums. So, you know, this comes down to at its very core, this idea about knowledge production and dissemination. I really want to emphasize that in doing this, we need to be explicit in explaining to our students things like knowledge production and dissemination and why we're involving them in the creation of their curriculums. But, you know, a very practical, pragmatic way of talking about this and doing it is to really start off a semester asking your students, this is what the curriculum is going to look like, and asking them, what do they think of the reading list? Asking them, what do they think of the themes and topics? Are they actually relevant? And then I've put here devoting at least 1 week to a student chosen topic, right? I've put down the mechanism for how one can go about doing this and getting students to vote on this, then getting students to actually present in that class, and emphasizing that the contributions from students, the comments that they make in the class, and when they are busy co-creating and deciding upon topics in their actual curriculums, that their knowledge is just as valuable and worthwhile as what their, you know, the journal articles that you may be prescribing may be. I don't have enough time to talk about it, but I'm also really enthusiastic about students choosing their own methods of assessment instead of me dictating to them how it is that they're going to be assessed in every instance. So we can talk more about that if anyone is interested in the Q&A section. I just put here a couple of examples from, obviously we've been lecturing on Zoom, so I've put together a couple of examples here of polls that I had done with my students to see, you know, things that I think would never have come up if my students hadn't suggested this, their ability to be able to vote on that, and us to dedicate time to lectures on topics that they feel actually represent their lived economic realities. So just a quick note on textbooks and the importance again of drawing in that work of Ndlovu Khatsheni about knowledges. You know, I personally refuse to use a textbook in my classroom, much as I think that there are certain instances where a chapter out of a textbook can be particularly useful. I think it is massively important to explicitly explain and show students and encourage them to see knowledge as things that come in articles and book chapters and podcasts and videos and blogs and Twitter threads. I even use memes in my classroom, and my students have taught me a lot through memes, thinking about things like your grandparents' wisdom, and that by, you know, the formal institution of a university not being seen as knowledge, but us starting to begin to break down that idea. There are definitely a lot of structural power relations that may prevent this from actually being possible. But I would emphasize, you know, if there's any academics here, or if there are any students that kind of feel like their lecturers would be massively against this, to at the very least ask for 1 week in which you could co-create, and then ensuring that the additional resources that are provided, even if it is you as a student who's recommending these resources, that at least one of those authors come from the Global South. I've put here that we need to be explicit about why and how it is that we're doing it, and again, that we have to organize around this, which is why I think something such as this is such a wonderful opportunity for us to have collaboration between academics in South Africa, in Nigeria, from, you know, all over the African continent. I think we definitely need more of that collaboration. I had put here just a very quick slide about economic pluralism. So over here is just, I've taken it from like my e-learning platform. So I teach macroeconomics at postgraduate level, and then I teach development economics at undergraduate level and at postgraduate level. And so again, I don't have enough time to talk through all of this, but something that myself and my husband, actually, we teach this macroeconomics module together, is to ask questions about, you know, when you get some of the discussions around why economic pluralism won't work, that there isn't enough time, that students can't cope, that this simply isn't true. I think this really just isn't true. I think that there is an opportunity to be able to, you know, engage with your lecturers to say, well, perhaps in certain themes, there are certain schools of thought that might be stronger than other schools of thought. And to definitely, I do think that we need to teach the mainstream. We can have lots of debates about why and how, but that at least in each of the themes, that one alternative school of thought is presented. And so perhaps you guys could see here in the alternative growth perspectives, I will first teach, the mainstream approaches to growth, and then perhaps juxtapose this with feminist economics and a lot of their really astounding, insightful critiques on the way in which mainstream growth theory approaches the idea of growth and indeed of development, right? So again, I would love to talk more about this. You can see some of the just highlights of some of the assessment methods, which again, I don't quite have time to talk through, but again, maybe in the question and answer session. But I'm really passionate and enthusiastic, much as I think economic pluralism can sometimes happen, and it's definitely not addressing some of the key components of decolonizing the curriculums. I do think that economic pluralism is an important component of decolonizing our curriculums. I'd also put here then a slide about beyond the confines of economics. And so again, I just have little snapshots here. But this is a piece that I was actually recommended by one of, well, I would say a colleague, even though he doesn't work at the same university as me, but I'm part of Decon, which is a initiative that you guys might have heard a little bit about. And I had been recommended this piece, which is called The Racial Vernaculars of Development, A View from West Africa. I had set this as an essay question for my students. And really, I think this is the importance of us having an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach to economics. Very few economics lecturers, I think, are teaching anything about anthropology. But if one is to actually read this piece, and the question that I'd set for my students is to actually take a look at this from an anthropologist and compare this with the World Bank's systematic country diagnostic of what is the development challenges within South Africa. And so if you kind of take a look at this in conjunction with a lecture I'd recently given also on the history of African economic thought, I thought it was quite interesting to take a look at the YSI's, just a snapshot of what is on their website in a discussion about the history of African economic thought, asking questions about this great gap and where is the history of African economic thought. And if you take a look at, you do just a quick, Google search, what pops up on Wikipedia of some of the suggestions of people whose work one can draw from, you would see that not a single one of their titles says economist, right? They are writers, and they may be sociologists, anthropologists, they may specialize in literature actually. And so I really think that this emphasizes the importance of, as we begin to have a discussion about decolonizing as a process, that we think through the importance of a interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach when we're changing our economics curriculums. I think I'm close on my 10 minutes. So this is pretty much... Thanks, Abdul. So this is pretty much my last reflection. This is from an absolutely excellent book called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And I think that this quote, it's clear that equality doesn't quite cut it. Asking for a sliver of disproportionate power is too polite a request. I don't want to be included. Instead, I want to question who created the standard in the first place. And I think as economists, we need to be asking ourselves, as we are decolonizing our curriculums, who created the standard in the first place? And much as this is my kind of final thought on it, much as I think this can be confusing and frustrating and uncertain and seem like there are insurmountable challenges, I think more than anything, we should be excited and look forward to asking how a diverse group of people can build and construct anew. So there we go. Maybe keep co-creating. If you guys have comments, questions, critiques, there's my email address and my Twitter handle. I would be so keen to hear more of your thoughts and engage beyond just this workshop. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I couldn't stop you because you were making a lot of sense, and I don't want to cut you short.
Sorry.
If you look at the chat, I just posted some acronyms that Michelle mentioned. DECON stands for Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics, which is a new group. And one of our previous speakers, Dr. Daniela, is part of the DECON, so if you can visit them, they post a lot of things on pluralist economics. And YSI stands for Young Scholars Initiative, is part of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. They also have a lot of working groups, and you can join. Yeah, next one, Mr. Bandile.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to this Pluralist Economics workshop that is hosting me, and to all the sponsors. As has been mentioned before, my name is Bandile Ngidi. I'm the project coordinator for the Rethinking Economics project at the Institute for Economic Justice. And part of the work we do, or that I do, is basically working with students in the Rethinking Economics for Africa student movement. But also I do other work in public education for economics. And that's really the perspective that I'll be coming at this question from. I'm not in the formal academy, and so my perspective is a slightly broader perspective on what is required to decolonize economics. And I think it follows on very closely to what Michelle has been speaking about. So I'll get into some of that and some of the work that I do and the implications for decolonizing economics. So I think as a nice response to what Michelle has been laying out, I think we need to remind ourselves maybe of a definition of decolonizing. I think it's one of those contested terms, as Michelle had mentioned before, where people aren't really quite sure of the definition, but I think a nice working definition of the call to decolonize economics is basically the process of firstly recognizing the colonial histories that inform our current world, and then secondly, divesting from colonial practices in the teaching and learning and research and other elements of the discipline of economics. And so those two things are the major things that we need to consider when we're considering what it means to decolonize. We both have to fully recognize the role of history in shaping our economies, and then fully recognize really what the whole economics discipline is about. And what that means is basically we need to look at the content of the curriculum. We need to look at what we think our vision of economics, the fully well-taught economic student. We need to look at who teaches economics. We need to look at the institutional structures, such things as, economists, economic departments. What are the goals and incentives and disincentives that shape how economics curricula are designed? We need to look at also, sort of what we think is the role of economic researchers. We need to look at, finally, what is the role that economists play in public discourse? And so my first sort of provocation is that when we're thinking about economics, we need to look at this as kind of like concentric circles, looking out from not just what's in the textbook, but who's learning it, who's teaching them, who's informing, who's teaching them, what is the public role of institutions, and then sort of this final part, which as academic economists we never get into, what is the public role of economists, both in research, in informing policy, and in informing general debates and discussion. And so that's my first point. On sort of the issues raised by decolonization, and this is kind of the flavor that I want to add into this discussion. I just want to refer to an important paper written by Sean Miller in 2017 that lists out sort of some of the issues we need to think about that are raised by the decolonizing, the call to decolonize ecolonics. So the 5 issues that are raised by Muller, which I think are very critical, is that we need to remember the context, the content and context, how issues are framed, are issues properly contextualized, is what we're learning in economics relevant to the real world, and issues of accessibility. So when we reflect on what we should be including in a decolonized curriculum, firstly, we have to think to ourselves, what are the most important economic issues for our countries, right? I think in South Africa, part of what is one of our biggest issues is, economic inequality, our extremely high levels of unemployment. And so a decolonized economics curriculum would firstly start with identifying what content should be in and what are the most important questions that should be answered by an economics curriculum. Currently, our curriculum in South Africa is very theory focused and focused on the issues faced in the developed world. But some of these key issues which people face every day are not included in the main content that is covered. There's a question of framing and whether issues are framed correctly. Are they framed purely from a theoretical perspective, or are they, framed in a way that shows relevance to the real world? Similarly, on contextualization, are real life issues being put against sort of proper economic history? Are students being taught what are the historical factors that have caused certain economies to get onto a certain trajectory? And similarly with relevance and accessibility, one of the questions we need to ask in terms of decolonization is the question of, is the stuff that is being learned, or the methods that are being taught, etc., appropriate to the real world? In countries like South Africa or Nigeria, where say a lot of the economy is actually in the informal sector, is it appropriate for us, to be teaching a lot of the financial economics, or and neglecting some of the issues that are pertinent to how our economies are actually structured? So those are some of the few questions that I'll just add on as key points to remember when we're decolonizing economics. I think as a second big thing, knowing that 10 minutes is very short, is to then think about what we actually consider as the curriculum. And in the work I do, I kind of refer to three big parts of the curriculum. So there's the academic curriculum, which is, what we learn as when you're formally signed up for a degree. And Michelle has kind of gone into that. But the other elements of the curriculum, which I think we need to consider in conversations around decolonizing the curriculum, are firstly the extracurricular curriculum. So the other ways in which students could come to gain economic knowledge. So that's through, student organizing, that's through the various sources in which they could get information or learning about the curriculum. So through, reading groups and other, organized activities and things like that. Because one of the big issues that I found in my work is that there's a complaint that there's simply not enough time to cover everything, and students are often overwhelmed by the amount of work that they're doing in a standard economics undergrad. So we need to have some level of creativity in how a person who's doing a full-time degree could come to learn and get other sources of information. And I think the last thing would be considering the third part of the broad curriculum, which is the public curriculum. So in the work that I do, I think it's very important to create linkages between student groups and broader civil society, because students, on the one hand, are future teachers, they're future economists, they're future creators of knowledge, and it's critical for them to be orientated towards other groupings in society. So in decolonizing economics, I think we need to also, as we expand that movement, we need to try and create those linkages between students and, in the South African case, it would be like trade unions or NGOs and things like that, and get them to think about the common issues that are faced in society, and see how they can share knowledge that they learn in the classroom, but also learn from these sorts of groups in the economic knowledge that they produce. Those are my sort of few provocations that I have, knowing that Michelle would have come with a very good presentation. I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Bandile. I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of points you raised. Abel, can you go next, please?
Yes, hi. So, my name is Abel, and I've been introduced already. Unfortunately, I'm also not in formal academia, and I'm not going to talk about behavioral economics. I've been having side projects that I've been researching into, so that is what I will be talking about mostly. Let me share my screen quickly. Yeah, so yeah, I just did this presentation this morning, so it's a little clumpy, but I start with an outline. So Prof. Abdul and Daniel, Michelle, and Bandile have talked about a lot, especially on the theoretical side. So that leaves me with the freedom to talk about a few other things. I would first like to point out that from a big picture perspective, there is a tendency for coloniality to emerge when there is substantial material inequality between societies. So we see this from the Neolithic revolution at first, which transformed societies from gatherer hunters to sedentary agricultural. So the position we are in at this moment in history in the past, say 500 years, is associated with the second large-scale economic revolution and its own injustices. But we have examples of northern Chinese. Why, for example, do you perceive China to be more or less homogeneous, like from an outside perspective? Over thousands of years, there was cultural, what do you call it? Cultural imperialism of some sort from northern China to southern China, based on difference in material capabilities, and you have back to West Africans over sub-equatorial Africa, Maori and Maori. In each of these cases, there were farmers going into gatherer-hunter lands, and this social transformation is less recorded, so you do not have the debates of injustices and all this that we have now. So I would first like to point that out, that it is the material inequalities at first. So you may still have these risks, even with say two socialist countries that are materially unequal. Now we have let's take the approach of looking at three processes in geocentric colonization. So at first you have the stripping, as Professor Garba has talked about, so I will not go too deep into this, the stripping of so the liberal precursors, of liberal economics, orthodox economics today, into the 18th century and to some extent the 17th century, they have been stripped of their epistemological, ethical, methodological, and ontological robustness, as Professor Garba has talked about. And so I don't need to go there. So within Western Europe itself, within the core of Western Europe, you have this process going on. And then within Europe itself, the periphery of the European periphery you have neglect of contributions of thinkers within that European periphery, like the Neapolitan and Italian thinkers. And when they teach you about the French economists, the physiocrats, they neglect, your teachers neglect to tell you that they were anti-physiocrats. They neglect to tell you that the wealth of nations was a response or a contribution to the rich country, poor country debates of the 18th century, sparked by David Hume, and so more. Just as today's debates, we have debates about convergence and divergence. There were debates in the 18th century, likewise. And then the neglect of contestations of capitalism from its onset. So socialists, for example, alternatives and different alternative modes of production in reaction to the capitalist system that was emerging, and also the neglect of the long period of economic history, so economic anthropology and medieval history, which makes capitalism seem eternal. Like you just get some textbooks that just talk about trade in the past, and from trade emerged capitalism, and so it just seems like an eternal system, a homogeneous system, because they use the hegemon as the standard. So Britain or the as practiced in the US and Britain seem to be the standard, and so they neglect the varieties within capitalism itself. And then immutable as well, because it is eternal, it does not change. We have always had this, and so you get inflexibilities in any slight institutional innovation seems to be radical as such. And then in another cycle, you get neglect of contribution from non-Western sources. And this, you see, Dr. Bizo, Daniel has talked about this. I think Michelle also mentioned them. And I'm writing a paper currently on 19th century African responses to European, Western European modernity, which expands on present literature, like including Emily Ruet from Zanzibar, whose autobiography includes some economic concepts. And so neglect of non-Western contestations to capitalism also, you get in the literature terms like translative adaptation used for Japan, alternative localization used for Latin America, sovereign mobilization used for Ethiopia to describe this process where thinkers think about what is happening in Europe, in Western Europe, and then translate it to their local circumstances. And this influences the evolution of their institutional modifications within their societies. So it is, but then you are not taught, say in Africa, the 19th century pre-colonial attempt at modernization had this embedded in them. So you have Chinese Fujian economic nationalism. Unfortunately, China did not fail to industrialize in the 19th century. So what you get a predominance of Meiji thinkers in the literature over Chinese thinkers. And then you see this tendency in the Merina Empire, in Madagascar, and eventually African socialism in reforms interpreted in terms of Islamic nomenclature in North Africa. And yeah, so also when they teach, there's a division between development economics and standard economics. But what is neglected is that for each aspect of standard economics, when they teach you the history of macroeconomics, they do not teach you the southern side of each. So Paul Volcker's, the Volcker shock, raising interest rates in the 1980s, causing or precipitating the third world debt crisis, the US post-war Keynesianism stimulating industrialization in East Asia, and British unilateral free trade giving the rise of the US and Germany in the 19th century, and intensification of international competition. The British continued unilateral free trade instead of demanding reciprocal free trade, but that was only possible because the British depended on Indian finances, Indian balance of payments relations to finance the balance of payments problems. But quickly, I will go into the structural basis. The structural basis of this. So there's a cognitive bias, or first, the hegemon, the ideological hegemony that's the hegemon, in this case, the US, but and Britain, but previously dominantly Britain, arises because of its technological advancement. So it can support free trade and abstraction from reality because it benefits the most in doing so. And so you have support for flexible wage markets because based on abstract economic concepts, because it is pro-capital, and support for low taxes and such. And you see the influence of capital in the construction of this knowledge process. So corporations and financiers fund economics research, political parties, think tanks, conferences, prizes. Think of the Nobel Prize. It was a capitalist, and monetary authorities, the governor of the central bank or the Federal Reserve Bank coming from the finance sector, and the finance sector employing liberal economists, people who, and these are the most highly paid economists, business economists, tending not to need awareness of pluralist approaches to economics, and so they are employed in the sector and making money, and they're the ones submitting to the top journals and organizing all these conferences. And think of what is happening right now. You are in Nile University. The person who organized this conference, Abdulrasheed, came from SOAS University, but SOAS is presently in deep financial stress right now. As a deeply heterodox university in the UK, its funding is a little precarious. Some the more pluralist and other disciplines are funded, subsidized by other disciplines in demand. So you see the relation between the labor markets and incomes and tuition fees. The students who come to university to study pay tuition fees, and these are related to labor market outcomes, which are dominated by financial sector and business concerns. So you see that structural relation throughout the system. And the hegemon also having
if you can be quick, please. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just stop here. The hegemon having dominant position in international institutions and influencing development research and all that. Yeah, I think I'll just stop there.
You can go ahead, maybe summarize in 1 minute. Yeah, and then we can.
Okay. Yeah, in our response to this, one thing I would like to mention is that in my research on 19th century African economic thoughts and history, one thing I found was the intra-African relations that are not explored within the literature, even of those who recognize the paucity of research in independent African attempts at modernization. So examples of these are Sultan Said Bargash of Zanzibar, after visiting England to seek foreign investment, passing through Egypt and meeting Khedive Ismail Pasha to ask for thoughts and advice about modernizing his military, and also making marriage proposals to Queen Rana Vanola of the Merina Empire in order to access the Merina Empire's wealth, and during its attempts at modernization, and Egypt having plans for conquering the whole of the Horn of Africa, and James Houghton influencing the creation of the Fanti Confederation in West Africa. So these are intra-African relations that researchers tend to focus instead on European-African relations and neglecting horizontal relations. So yeah, that is one area of research that has a gap. Yeah, I'll just stop there.
Okay, that is great. Thank you so much, Abel. Yeah, so there's this one question which, before I even continue talking, I'd like to hear your views. How can we decolonize the economics curriculum when the majority of the economics lecturers in economics, majority of the economics lecturers do not have a background in heterodox economics and or decolonial pedagogy to promote that change? So Michelle, I think this is probably directed at you. Yeah.
Yeah, I will again try to be quick about this one. I think the first step is acknowledging that that is a reality, right? Knowing that this is a problem is the first step. So I would say my suggestion is twofold. Firstly, to emphasize the importance of students. So I think it's one thing to go to your lecturers and for them to have to admit that they have not been trained or know about necessarily these authors, this content, this work, and to accuse them. And another thing to say, I would genuinely like to be a partner in this, right? I think that academics having to admit that they don't know something is very big and scary. So I think having open communication with your lecturers, that they can't be blamed for not knowing this. This is the nature of the structural inequalities that there are in the nature of knowledge production. So I think really having a partnership with your lecturer to have that open communication. But secondly, to not feel like it is only the job of your lecturer to have to know about this. I think there is no doubt that you are likely to learn the most when you are the one who's responsible for explaining it. So I think, you know, if you're going to go to your lecturer and say, I genuinely think that this is a topic that we're not addressing, that's not being looked at in the curriculum, or this is a skill for that matter, right? The skill of critical thinking, and the skill to not just critique and deconstruct, but also to reconstruct, whatever it may be. And to say, myself and 10 other people out of a class of 200, right, that are really enthusiastic about this are going to start a reading group, are going to come to your office, and we're going to together read up about this, figure it out, and we would like to co-lecture for a whole week on this topic, right? I think you as a student are going to learn so much by you being the one who knows that it is your responsibility to have to learn this and teach this to someone else. And I think that's probably going to really inspire your lecturers to hopefully recognize this about themselves and hopefully, you know, take on this journey for more pluralist education and a more decolonized education themselves. And then last single sentence about this, I would say I have seen the most progress and willingness from really young academics. So if there's kind of like a strategic way to go about this, I think approaching your younger lecturers who haven't kind of been teaching the same thing for the past 30 or 40 years. I think we have so much to look forward to with young academics that are looking forward to learning about this themselves.
Yeah, great. Bandile or Abel, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same thoughts, that a lot of this work is going to have to happen outside the classroom. But I think it's possible to do it outside the classroom. This discourse on decolonizing and its related sort of themes of pluralism, And you know, that sort of discussion has been going on for a while. There are lots of internet resources, and I think a lot of it requires people to break out of a mindset. Firstly, that as Michelle was saying, that academics are the fount of all knowledge. But secondly, there's a point about what people think the point of their economics education is. And I think the grand majority of people in most economics, who are undergraduate economics students, kind of think economics is just to learn about like finance and how, you know, the financial markets work. Maybe some stuff on like mineral resources, things like that. But they also have a very bad understanding of what you know, they need to, what the point of an economics education is. And sorry, just to add on that, I think there is another layer of people who can assist, and that would be you know, who you can call economics practitioners, so researchers, people who are out in the field. You know, and those people can actually create a further layer that helps to assist academics who might be trained in a particular way and might not have a good sense actually of, you know, what a real world relevant economics discipline is.
Abel?
Yeah, they've said everything, but I just want to point out that we are also seeking something that will be resilient in the face of the dynamics of economic crisis. So departments tend to suffer a lot when it's time to, or when there are pressures for reduction of budgets, and when education spending goes down, and the more economic history goes out, and they start to pick up things. And so there's that dynamic. But also there's potential also to learn from inter-southern tendencies. So we see Africa suffers a lot because there are less African scholars. The percentage of African scholars talking about Africa is less than that of Latin American.
Am I the only one? I can't hear Abel again.
I think I've lost him as well.
Okay, nice. Maybe briefly, I want us to talk about race. So especially in the context of Black Lives Matter and the whole new recognition of racial injustice across the world. What is your view of the state of race in economics? I know it's not good, but I just want to hear what you guys can say, especially role of race in economic theory, economic history, development economics, and how we can.
There's potential to learn from.
Yeah, Michelle, can we go?
No, I was just going to say, I think Abel is maybe coming through a little bit. I don't think that it's necessarily a good thing for me to talk about this one first. So I think...
Bandile.
Yeah?
Great, I'll give it a go. Look, I think the state of race in economics is not at the level it could be. And sadly, it's pretty much on all the factors. So sort of teaching complements, or rather, the teaching staff is not yet diversified in many places, and especially in the top influential sort of schools of economics or departments of economics around the world. And I think there's also a problem in the extent to which we discuss race in economics, and that's, I think, largely just because of the deficits of the history of economic thought, especially in undergrad curricula. I think there hasn't been, and I think in comparison, you can actually look at the proliferation sort of feminist economic thought as an interesting comparator, where there's been, I think in recent years, a much greater resurgence or much greater flourishing of thoughts, and actually like analytic thoughts where people can understand what are the mechanisms behind gender inequality. But I think race hasn't really reached that point. The only big contributions I think so far have been in some global north centers, where, you know, my understanding of SOAS, so as an outsider from SOAS, I think I've seen some work being done on that. But I think it's one of those things that need more global proliferation, and actually getting people to understand why we need to be discussing it.
Yeah, that is really great. Does any one of you have some heroes in decolonizing economics? Maybe someone whose work you really like, and you can recommend to all of us. Like mine, maybe I would say is Professor Thandika Mkandawire, who sadly passed away, I think some months ago. But I would like to hear some of your heroes from Africa or from other parts of the global south.
Can I give it a go?
All of you, yeah.
I think, and this will be a funny thing to say because he's not really characterized as a decolonial economist, but I think the work of Hajin Chang does a lot of great, you know, really pushes the agenda forward, precisely because a part of decolonizing economics is making sure that economic knowledge doesn't only sit with academics. So one of the potential pitfalls is that academics will replace kind of the current mainstream with an also very insular, very theory-laden, you know, sort of inaccessible is what I mean to say, inaccessible heterodox canon. But I think Hajin Chang, in taking a specific approach to say, how do I make economics accessible to as many people as possible? Some of the best books being, you know, 21 Things, Economics, a User Guide. That has actually done a lot to democratize economics. And that's one component, I think, in the process of decolonizing that we should avoid, and we should look towards a person like Hajin Chang to show us the way.
Abel?
Yeah, for me, also in Ngidi, I was hoping before he passed away, I was hoping to do my PhD under him at LSE, but unfortunate. But also, Eric Helena has an agenda for a more global international political economy, and it is based on that I've largely been that has guided my research line of research for the past 2 years. So he has done work on Latin America and China, and pointed out points of neglect and gaps even within the colonial movements on topics within those areas. So yeah.
Michelle?
So I struggle to just choose one. I think Samir Amin has done some really amazing work. That's a lot of food for thought. I think it should also be obvious from my presentations. I really draw a lot from Sobedo Ndlovu Khacheni's work. And then Nkrumah, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but just for a second here, at his, he was speaking, he had made a speech at the Organization of African Unity in 1963. So I had just wanted to read this tiny piece of quote from him. We can tackle hopefully every emergency, every enemy, and every complexity. Unite we must. We must unite in order to achieve the full liberation of our continent. And I think, you know, when we're talking about things like, I see one of the questions in the Q&A that has come through here is, how do we decolonize economics in practice? I think this discussion is so important for us to be able to ask, you know, I see it was also the professor who was apparently asking, well, what do we do if we don't have the knowledge necessarily? It wasn't a student asking about this. And I think things like this, right? That if we are uniting in what it is that we are all discovering together, it's much easier for us to be able to take this process forward, right? In just answering the question about in actual practice, for students, I think it is about demanding that you don't have a single textbook. It is about telling and engaging your lecturers that they are not the fountain of all knowledge. And it's about, once you leave the university, asking yourself, are we just going to go work for a big financial industry? Or are we going to take the more difficult path, right? How are we going to engage with people who don't necessarily have a university postgraduate degree in economics, right? How can we share that knowledge with people that are in our communities, right? Whoever it is that had sent these questions, please by all means pop me a DM on Twitter. I would love to have further discussions about it, but I think those are some of the really practical ways that we can do that. But Abdul, I think opportunities like this is so important.
Great, we can take this last question and perhaps just close. It's a long question and I'm afraid I cannot summarize it, but you guys can have a look at it. So it's asking, how can we counter decolonized economy, and with the purpose of broadening our field to become more inclusive of diverse approaches and perspectives, we need to put together an alternative list. We deliberately chose books by scholars approaching economics with alternative theoretical frameworks, and by scholars from groups that tend to be excluded from the field, namely women, people of color, and scholars from the global south. We recognize that no one is exempt from biases. So maybe this is a comment, but probably maybe the person is trying to say, okay, even if we want to decolonize, we're still like ruled by our own bias. So I don't know if I'm getting it right.
I don't know, I can, because I think the question is, how can we counter, right? So I think it's, I don't know, it sounds like also typical academic. This is more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do just want to maybe push, based on this comment, the importance of interdisciplinarity. I think that economists, if we look at like what narrative economics did, when economists are talking about this, now it matters, right? Which is the nature of, I think Ben Fine talks about economic imperialism. There's also a really great paper called The Superiority of Economists. But I think we need to just take a step back and learn from other disciplines, right? There has been a lot of work from other disciplines talking about scholars that exist, work that exists, from anthropology, sociology, psychology, that deals with, from historians that deals with us. And I think we just need to recognize that, to engage with that, and to move beyond just this idea of we're only going to take a look at what it is that economists are doing, because realistically, I don't think that economists up until now have been particularly insightful about this topic yet.
Yeah, exactly. And I really accept the idea of interdisciplinarity. Economists, maybe I will say again, we're very arrogant. We think we're like the queen of social sciences. In my department at Ahmad Bello University, in the billboard for economics department, it is written the queen of social sciences. And you have, yes, so you have this impression that you do maths, you do lots of econometrics and modeling, that you are smarter than people from political science or sociology. Yeah, but I think that is great to be learned from those fields. And in fact, nowadays, if you look at behavioral economics, most of their discoveries, they are common sense in psychology, in sociology. If economists will be a little humble to read works that don't necessarily deal with modeling, I think we will understand the world better and we will do our job much, much better. Otherwise, we will just be running models that have little resemblance with reality. Yeah.
Yeah, and so...
Can I speak in very quickly?
Oh, yeah.
Just a thought that's come to me, though, on what it means to decolonize in practice. That's kind of like a difficult question. And I think people should sit with the discomfort of not having a straight answer, precisely because the real answer is it's going to be dependent on your context, and it's going to be a long-term process. And I think it's, you know, when this question is asked, it's maybe sometimes asked when, you know, your cold, harsh head of department is trying to get a sense of, okay, what do you really want to do here? And you know, we should try and co-create measures of success. It might be quantitative measures, like saying, okay, maybe we have a certain percentage of people in our curriculum, the authors that we quote, be, you know, women and be Africans and this and that. But I think we should still be very comfortable with understanding that it's going to be something that we do as communities of practice, and it's going to be a long-term thing, and kind of make peace with that.
Okay, great. I don't know if all of you can have some closing remarks, 20 seconds each. Yeah.
Okay, you can go first. So I'm because I think mine will be the shortest. I do think this work is hard work. It's long work, and I think people should draw on colleagues near and far to try and get it done. In the different contexts that I work and I see it, you kind of can get overwhelmed, but you should be drawing on forums like this, but also working with others. That's the major thing that we need to consider in trying to decolonize.
Yeah, I would also say, yes, it is a long process. The societies that struggle with Greek Hellenization did not, they fumbled, like Hellenization proceeded. This is the only time when we have some democratic capabilities to deal with colonial influence like this. So I think we should be optimistic, even though the structures of power within the system, the selection biases for non-decolonial perspectives are still present.
Yeah. I would say that we are more powerful than what we realize. So the power of students making sure that they ask, and if they don't get, demand what it is that they want. There is massive power in that, inside and outside the classroom. And I think that academics are more powerful than what they think they are. To stop running the model that only has race as a proxy variable, and to just stop and read and teach yourself and introspect and reflect, and then bring that into the classroom and outside of the classroom. I think we have so much more power than what we give ourselves credit for.
Yeah, great. I'm sure we've only scratched the surface. Just 1 hour is not enough to talk a lot about this, and I'm sure we haven't covered all that we should talk about. I'm also convinced that you guys have shared a lot of knowledge with us, and I would like to thank all of you for your time and for your efforts. And also, thank you so much to our participants who have joined us from different parts of the world. And let the struggle continue. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, bye. Thank you.